So we're going to be thinking in this session, this first session today and again tomorrow, on this issue of preaching with variety. I don't know how many of you preach frequently, preach often. I preach pretty much every Sunday, at least one sermon every Sunday in my current role. And if you're a bit like that, if you preach regularly, you may have noticed a tendency or a temptation for maybe just your sermons to begin to all sound and feel a little bit similar, perhaps. You know, regardless of where you're preaching, if you're preaching from Exodus or Hebrews or the Psalms, they kind of feel a bit the same. If you maybe listen to the same preacher all the time, you may have noticed that tendency in that person as well. And we can begin to just lose a little bit of variety in how we communicate and how we teach God's word. But is that a problem? Should we be concerned about a lack of variety in our preaching? Well, I think we should. But why is this a problem? Well, I guess, firstly, no one likes listening to boring sermons, do they? Anyone here like listening to boring sermons? No, great, I'm glad. But I think we could go a bit further than that, although that in itself is a fairly compelling reason. God's word should never be presented in a dull and boring way. But if we think about it, God reveals his word to us, himself to us in his word with variety, doesn't he? God communicates his word in many different kinds of writing, different styles of literature, and so on. God didn't choose to give us a textbook or a systematic theology when he revealed himself to us. He gave us a book with lots of different kinds of writing. I'm sure you've thought about this already, but let's just get some down on paper. What different kinds of writing can you think of in the Bible? Psalms? Good. Letters? Good. Sorry about my terrible writing, by the way. I hope you can read this. Gospels? Yeah. Okay, narratives? Narrative, okay. Good. Wisdom? Good. Prophecies, does someone say? Prophecy, yeah. History. Good. Yeah. Apocalypse, good. Good. Oh, Gospels we mentioned, yeah. I might break Gospels up into different things. A lot of them, of course, are narrative. We have stories, but we also have things like sermons or speeches written in there as well. So why don't we say, you know, kind of long units of speech and so on. Parables, good. Wisdom, yeah. I can't write it there now, can I? So why don't we go here? Parables. We could keep going, and some of these things overlap, of course. But that's just kind of in a couple of minutes of thinking about, how many have we got there? At least 10. And we could probably think of a few others, particularly when we start to break down these into smaller categories. So we could think of psalms. Well, you have different kinds of psalms. You have laments, or you have, you know, more praise type things. But anyway, that's great for now. So God reveals himself with variety in his words, doesn't he? We can see that there. And I think it's a really good idea to stop and reflect. Why does God choose to reveal himself with variety? We kind of take it for granted, don't we, if we're familiar with our Bibles. Why does God choose to reveal himself in all these different kinds of writing? Because he's sovereign? Yes, good. And I think that's an important thing we'll come back to in a moment. Because God is creative, yeah. Sorry? Good, yes, I think there's something very Trinitarian about this variety, as actually in terms of the creation as well. When God creates, he doesn't give us one kind of plant, he gives us millions. Not one kind of animal, gives us millions. He doesn't create in black and white, he creates in colour. So it's a very in keeping thing to do with God's character, isn't it? And I think there's also this element, as you touched on here, with the idea of God being sovereign. God chooses the best genre, that's the posh word for all these different kinds of things, you're probably familiar with that. God chooses the best genre to get his particular message across at any one point. And I think that's worth remembering, because has anyone in this room not trawled through the book of Revelation, or maybe the second half of Daniel, and thought, why does this have to be so complicated? Couldn't God have revealed himself in an easier to understand way than, Daniel chapter 10 or something? Have you ever felt like that? I have, if I'm honest. But God always chooses the best type of writing to get across his message at any given point. And actually, we do this all the time, don't we? I was thinking about this the other day, and if I want to communicate to my wife that I love her and how much I appreciate my wife Alison, well, I've got different ways, haven't I? But I might go to the shop and I might buy a card, and I might sit down at my desk and sort of give it some thought. If I'm feeling creative, I might even compose a poem, and I'll write in a certain way to my wife Alison, here's how much I love you, here's what I appreciate about you. But on another given day, we're rather busy in Torino, and we might be both busy about the house with our different things to do. And Alison says to me, Hugh, would you just be able to run to the grocery store, please? And sure, that's fine. So Alison will sit at the kitchen table in our apartment, and she'll scribble on a piece of paper a list of things to buy from the grocery store. She'll give me a shopping list. Well, I would be a bit weird, wouldn't I, if I were to pick the list up and say, it's not very romantic, Alison, is it? Yeah? Couldn't you have made those rhyme, and milk and bread, that doesn't scan very well. Do you know what I mean? We've just communicated to each other in styles that are appropriate and best for the occasion. Doesn't mean Alison doesn't love me, and it doesn't mean her shopping list isn't operating in a loving relationship. If you don't believe me, you give your shopping list to a total stranger and ask them to pick a few things up from the shop and see if they do it for you. So it's still operating within a loving relationship, but a love letter has a different purpose in a way, doesn't it, to a shopping list. And I think it's worth bearing this in mind, that God always chooses the right genre to communicate at any given time. So really, we need to communicate with variety, because God himself communicates with variety. If God reveals himself in his word in all this colour, in all this variety, in all these different forms and shapes, and we choose to kind of just try and iron out those differences a bit, it can't quite be right, can it? We need to appreciate the colour with which God is revealing himself in order to show that to others. Because that's what we are doing as Bible teachers or as preachers. We are trying to represent the Word of God. We were thinking about this a bit yesterday, weren't we? We're not looking to bring our own ideas to the Bible and kind of improve it. We are looking to represent God's truth as he reveals it in his Word to those people who are listening to us. And that's the great danger, I think, if you preach regularly. There's a great danger, isn't it, to try and take shortcuts. You know, to just save some time, to just save a few hours, bypass the hard graft of preparation. Do you ever feel that temptation? Oh, you're too embarrassed to admit it. I do, okay? I have this temptation all the time. I struggle with laziness, and if I can find a way of saving time, of skimping on my preparation, I'll be tempted to take it. And of course, one way of doing that is, okay, I've got a sermon outline, and it works really well. Now I just need to get this text, fit it in there somehow. Peter mentioned this again yesterday. The tradition I grew up in my church background, growing up in Wales in the UK, was every sermon I heard, I could tell you before the preacher got up what the form would be. He'd have an introduction, he'd have 3 points, and a conclusion. Whoever the preacher was, whatever the passage was, it would always follow the same form. Maybe the church traditions you're in are slightly different, but there's a danger, I think, and this is one of the real dangers of fitting the message to fit our structure, to fit our form. And we're squeezing God's word into our nice little molds, and we can have these lovely pre-packaged sermons that all look the same, that all fit very nicely on the shelf, and we can just take them out and give them out. We begin to lose the colour and the variety with which God is revealing himself and revealing the good news of his love with. So, if we think then about, we need to preach and we need to teach as in faithfulness to God's revelation. We need to appreciate the form the text comes in. We need to be as obedient to the form of the text as we do to the content of the text. The message we are preaching, the message we are bringing to the people has come in a form from God. And if we're not alert to that, we can be on quite difficult ground, I think. Think of an example, Old Testament. What happens towards the Old Testament? You know the storyline, I'm sure, of the Old Testament. God's people come out of Egypt. God brings them into the Promised Land. Rocky starts. We get King David. Solomon starts well. Then things start to go wrong, don't they? And things start to go really wrong. The people of God begin turning away from the worship and the love of God. What does God do? How does God communicate to them at that point? Prophets, yes. And what do the prophets bring? Yep. So God chooses at that moment to bring prophets. And prophets speak prophecy. That's the message for today, by the way. Prophets speak prophecy. I can see you're overwhelmed with that bit of information I've just given you there. But what is prophecy? If you've ever tried preaching prophecy, of course it can be quite difficult. Even in our own Bible readings, sometimes we can be ploughing through some of those harder to understand prophets, and haven't we found that quite heavy going at times? Well, when we stop and think about it, the prophets are bringing a form of poetry. to God's people. They are often speaking a very powerful and sometimes a very direct and a strong message, strong language in a poetic form. Why does God use a poetic form to speak to his people? God uses an emotional genre, if I could say that, to communicate to his people that this bothers him. This hurts him. His bride has rejected him. His bride, the people of God he has called out to be his own people, have gone and prostituted themselves after other idols. That's an image you find a lot in the prophets, isn't it? This idea of being a prostitute with false gods. What if we lose sight of the fact that God has chosen to communicate this message in poetry? We lose the sense in which this is a very emotional thing. If we lose the heart of God, that's encapsulated as much in the form as in the words, we can get that feeling that God is kind of just there and he's just sitting in heaven and he's just blasting people. Do you see the difference? If we don't see that God has chosen to communicate in a way that says, I love you, I care for you, that's why I am angry about this. I'm not here to just be a judge and just declare damnation and destruction on you. I am upset about this because I love you. I am speaking to you with all my heart. I am bringing a poetic message to you. Do you see? Does that make sense? If we lose sight of the form the message comes in, we can maybe not quite be as sharp on the content as we could be. Or if I could put that more positively, if we are very clear on the significance of the form, the genre, the style, it can really help us to sharpen our understanding of the content of the text we're bringing. So if we fail to take note of how God communicates, I think we can really miss out. And at worst, sometimes we can really end up somewhere quite different from what the text is actually saying. So that's just by way of kind of a little bit of an introduction. And then if you read on this kind of idea of genre and different things, people will always categorize in different ways. Some people will tell you there are 7 main styles. We've got more than 7 already there. What we're going to do today and tomorrow is really just think about 3 big groups. And we're going to group some of these things together purely because we don't really have a whole lot of time to explore each one individually. So we're kind of going to, if I do something like this, and we're going to think of 3 groups, as I say, and it might just be helpful to think in terms of poetry, narrative, and what we call discourse. And those are so today we're going to concentrate on this middle column here, narrative, and then at this time tomorrow Peter will be with you and he's going to look to cover the other 2, the poetry and the discourse. So that's just to give you an idea of where we're going over the rest of this session and tomorrow. Are there any questions at this stage? We're going to sort of dive into narrative for the rest of this morning, but any questions or comments or anything right now? Does it make sense? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, if there's no questions, we'll pitch in. So, as I say, we're going to look at this middle section here, narrative. And if you choose to divide the Bible up into these 3 groups, narrative would take up the majority in terms of percentage of the text of the Bible. So God gives us a lot of stories, doesn't he? And a lot of history and parables. Yeah, I think probably parables should be closer to wisdom, but that was my problem with writing on the board. But we get many accounts, don't we, of stories of different characters and peoples and so on in the Bible. But how do stories work? Now, I'm not just thinking about biblical stories for a moment. Think of any kind of story. Nursery tale, that you tell your children, or your favorite movie, or your favorite book. I went to a session yesterday on Dostoevsky, and take your pick. Just think of any kind of story. And I'd be very, very, very surprised if your favorite story anywhere didn't have some of these, actually all of these elements that you'll see on the handout there. So firstly, there's a setting. And the story is rooted somewhere in history, in geography. Is it in the past? Is it in the present? Is it in the future? Is it in Poland? Is it in Italy? Is it in ancient Egypt? Is it in the Promised Land? Is it a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away? All these things have settings, don't they? And the setting can be very, very important. And the situation. What is the situation of the story? Why is that relevant to what we're going to see played out in front of us in the next few minutes or hours? What is the situation? In the days when the judges ruled, for example, there's a setting, and that's got a certain theological significance straight away, hasn't it? But secondly, we've got narrator. Who is telling the story? You see this in films and movies all the time. It might come to us in a first-person kind of setting, mightn't it? It all started when I was 5 and Jimmy came round with his new baseball glove. Yeah? And the story unfolds from a perspective of a narrator. It might be that the narrator is more detached and is just giving an account of the story. What kind of role does the narrator take? And I think this is very important when we come to the Bible and Bible stories. It's worth thinking about this whenever you're preaching a narrative in the Bible. Is what role does the narrator of the story, the Bible writer here, under the inspiration of the Spirit, take? He may choose to say, this person did this and it was a grievous thing in the eyes of the Lord. So he has passed a theological comment there. Be very clear that the thing this person did was not pleasing to God. Yeah? Theological comment. But similarly, you can find instances in the Bible where the Bible doesn't comment directly. And I think the Bible writer is very happy to just let us work it out for ourselves. Was that appropriate? Was that good? Was that wise and loving? Or was that something else? Thinking of an example, I was doing a Bible study last week in Daniel chapter 6. I'm sure you know the story, Daniel in the lion's den. Do you remember what happens at the end of Daniel 6? You know the story. These conspirators get together. We want to get rid of Daniel. So, well, it's going to have to be something to do with his God. Okay, we're going to say that anyone who prays to anybody other than you, king, they're going to be thrown into the lion's den. Daniel, of course, would rather die than not pray. And we know the story. He's thrown into the lion's den and the angel of God comes and closes the lion's mouth. What happens after that? Do you remember the next bit of the story? Exactly. The conspirators and their wives and their kids get thrown into the lion's den. And they're dead before they hit the floor, actually. The lions have mauled them to death before they get there. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What does the text say? This was a grievous thing in the eyes of the Lord? Or does the text say, well, they had it coming to them, didn't they? It's totally fair. The text is silent. The narrator is just saying, well, you've got a Bible. You go away and you work at that. There's an element of justice there. But what about those wives and kids? He doesn't pass comment. He just tells you what happens. And I think that's an invitation to just reflect on that. And just because this pagan king does that, we're not meant to always assume that the Bible writers approve of everybody's actions unless they say, this was a grievous thing in the eyes of the Lord, or something similar. And we need to be alert to that, how the narrator tells a story and why or why not they choose to comment theologically on the actions. Then, of course, we have characters. We have setting, narrator. We have to have characters in a story. Maybe one, maybe more. And we need to ask ourselves, what role are these characters taking in the story? You'll see now that I really have moved towards biblical stories, but these elements, as I say, will be found in any other kind of story. Are the examples that we see, are they perfect examples to follow all the time? Well, I can only think of one perfect example in the Bible. Jesus. We can have some perfect examples of who not to follow, can't we? There's some characters in the Bible who pretty much never do anything worth copying. So in Genesis 3, we meet a serpent, who we discover is the devil. He's a perfect example of someone not to follow ever, isn't he? I think of characters like Jezebel. She doesn't really have anything to commend her, does she? And you could probably think of some others. Haman, perhaps, in the book of Esther. Pretty much consistently wrong, bad, unloving, sinful. But then, of course, we have this other group of people who are flawed humans. They're imperfect people. And I hope we can relate to them. You know, they're guys who get it right, do amazing things with the help and the grace of God. And then you turn the page and you think, what on earth are you doing? Doesn't that put a little mirror back to us and we think, yeah, and I'm just like that. I enjoy the blessings of God, and I go out 2 hours later and I'm thinking, what did I just do that for? So we need to be very, very careful in terms of looking to characters as examples. Often the people we'll meet in the Bible will be examples to a point, but not always. And the other question we need to ask is the message of this text about giving us an example to follow, or is there something more than that? And I think sometimes it can be either or even both. Fourthly, we have plot, the unfolding story. How does the action unfold? I've given you a little chart there in the notes. This is a helpful thing to think about, and you can practice kind of spotting these elements of plot in your favourite movie if you like to kind of analyse things a bit. But we'll have an introduction, we'll have a situation, we'll meet the characters, we'll meet the setting. Then as the story unfolds, we get to number 2 there, where tension is introduced. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful little girl who lived happily with her mum and dad. In the nearby village, there was a wicked child catcher. Okay, you know where this is going. We have tension introduced. We know about the child catcher. We know that's not an incidental bit of information. We're already thinking, uh-oh. aren't we? The tension is introduced. And this is the same in biblical stories. The tension doesn't always have to be a problem. And we're going to see this in an example later on. Tension is often a problem, a dilemma. How is God going to fix this one? But it might be some other things, and I hope that will become clearer later on. So we'll come on to that. Thirdly, we'll see tension rising. Okay, this is getting serious now. How is God going to help? Is God going to answer prayer? Is God going to be able to bring his people out of Egypt? Or are those gods of Egypt just more powerful than Yahweh? Can God do it? Okay, he's brought them out of Egypt and they're stuck by the sea and the Egyptian armies are coming in. Now what are we going to do? You see the rising tension. The problem becomes greater. If we're entering into the story, you know, you've all done it, I guess, with movies at least. Haven't you hidden behind the cushion or you've gone, oh no! The rising tension. What's going to happen? And then at the climax of that tension, point 4 there on that chart, you see, the tension is finally resolved. In Bible terms, Goliath falls down with a stone in his head. The seas part and the children of Israel walk across on dry land. The walls of Jericho come tumbling down. On the third day, he rises again. The tension is resolved. And then finally, we'll have a conclusion there, point 5. What is the outcome? How has these events changed, affected the people who are involved in the story? Have they learnt any lessons? Have they reflected? Have they just carried on? We heard that this morning, didn't we? If you're in the plenary, has Jacob learned anything from these previous events, these previous narratives, these previous stories in his life? Well, kind of, but he's still got more to learn, and that's what we saw this morning, didn't we? So, if we are able to follow the plot line, this what I call a plot curve, in whatever story, whatever narrative you are preaching, I think it will really help you to pace and to form the outline of your sermon, of your talk, your Bible study, whatever it might be. It really forms a kind of an emotional map, an emotional journey that we go through. We often talk about being on an emotional roller coaster. You know that phrase? Emotional roller coaster. If you're up and down and you get to the end and you feel like, wow. Well, if we can plot the emotional roller coaster of our narrative, it's really going to help our people enter into the story and live out the story and identify with the characters who are being played out in the story in front of us. And that's what we want, isn't it? As preachers, we want people to enter into the world that we are looking at. We don't want to remain detached observers from 2,000 years or more. We, as Bible readers and the people we're speaking to, we want them to enter into the world that they're going through, to relate to the drama, relate to the character, to understand what it might have felt like to be Zacchaeus or whatever. The kind of technical thing is we want people to inhabit the text. That's just a posh way of saying we want them to live it out, to really get involved in the story. Some more notes there on understanding plot. We've talked about setting, but what's the pace of change? Just give that some thought. Is this story played out over years or months? Maybe just minutes often, in a very short space of time. It's just worth being alert to that. Speech and thought, Very, very important. The characters we meet in our stories, the things they say, or the things we're told they are thinking in the text, are going to say an awful lot about what is going on in their hearts. What is motivating these men and these women? What do their words and their thoughts say about their inward life? Similarly, number 3, their movement and action. When people take action, when people move, what does that say about their inward life? Think, for example, Book of Ruth, chapter 1, what do we find? Ruth 1 opens with a family from Israel moving to Moab. Okay, so what does that say about their inward life? Were they just taking a holiday? Was that just cool? Was that a good thing to do? Was that a kind of a theological decision? Was it an appropriate move? Does it say something about how they view God? These are all questions we can ask. I'm not going to unpack that one now, but what was Moab like? Should the people of God leave God's country and go live in Moab, even if they're in a famine? So movement can often say a lot of what is motivating and driving the characters in our stories, in our narratives. Tension and release, we've really talked about that already, but the conflict, the crescendo, the building of the tension and the climax, really take time to identify these key points in your stories, in your narratives. It will really help you to pace and to somehow capture that drama as you are re-presenting the story to your listeners. And then the resolution. What's the outcome? How have people responded? Just one more thing, and then I'm going to listen a bit more to you guys. You've been very patient listening to me. We're going to have a look at a text together. But just one more thing in terms of preaching narrative. How do stories then affect our sermons? How do they shape the form and the structure our sermons take? Well, I think firstly we need to trust the storyteller. That example I said earlier of, okay, here's a story and I've got a sermon outline. So the story has got to fit my predefined structure. That's inherently saying I don't trust this storyteller to have told the story properly, isn't it? If they didn't tell the story with an introduction, 3 points and a conclusion, we're basically saying, yeah, okay, that's good, but let's just rearrange this a bit. You know? Maybe they have an introduction and one big block and a conclusion. Maybe there's a change of scene, or, you know. But we need to trust the storytellers. The Bible writers, under the inspiration of the Spirit, were skilled storytellers. And we need to trust them that they have told the story well. And we also need to trust them that they have given us all the information we need. Now, they may not have given us all the information we want. That's a different issue. But in order to communicate God's truth, we have all the information we need in the text in front of us. Now, this can be a particular problem if you're preaching the Gospels. You know, if you're preaching something from Mark and there's a parallel account in Luke or maybe John, or have you ever done that? And it's tempting to just kind of think, okay, well, John gives us a few more details that Mark doesn't do. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to bring in the stuff from John as well. Oh, and Luke mentions something that's not there. And then we try and sort of build a kind of a mega text, you know, of 3 Gospels all together. And we're inherently, if we're preaching Mark, preach Mark. If you're preaching John, preach John. You know? Don't feel that, okay, well, Mark could have given us some more details, which he should have done. He's given us all the details for his particular message at that point in the Gospel. So trust the storyteller and re-present the story. We mentioned this yesterday. Don't use the story as a springboard into your agenda. Jesus tells the story of the Good Shepherd. I saw a shepherd once, and then 20 minutes later, you've kind of finished your story about how you saw a shepherd once. And anyway, back to do you know what I mean? We don't use the text as just something to launch into our agendas or our own thoughts on shepherds or what it means to be a shepherd and so on. Let's look at the Good Shepherd. Trust the storyteller and represent the story. Give the people you're talking to the story. Encourage them to enter into it. I'm aware that that's a lot of theory and quite a lot of information to just kind of throw at you. So I want to take now this sort of next 20 minutes or so to really work some of this through in a passage here from Luke 7, 1-10. But questions? That was a comment about, preaching the text in front of us doesn't mean that we should be blinkered to the rest of the Bible. So, of course, when we preach Old Testament texts, we don't want to pretend that we don't have a New Testament. And we may see Christ more clearly in an Old Testament text because, of course, we're this side of the cross and we have a New Testament in our Bible. So absolutely, we do need to be alert to the message of the whole Bible. I would absolutely agree with that it's not a question of ignoring everything else, but neither is it a question of kind of hanging there and then just kind of disappearing elsewhere as well. So thank you. That's a very helpful comment. I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things we're going to think about hopefully tomorrow is what kind of unit of text are you going to do there? If you preach through a chapter of Proverbs, you're going to have a lot of thoughts going on there. Are you going to take a verse? Or do you find a kind of a unity of kind of a 5-verse block perhaps? And there's a lot of debate, in this example of Proverbs. How much of a text should we choose to preach here? So I think that would be the first thing I would bear in mind. And then really to shape, the problems come, of course, then if you say, okay, well, I'm just going to take this one verse. Well, it's not it might be just 2 lines, mightn't it? Okay, well, how does this shape my sermon? In a sense, the form, the 2-line thing, I wouldn't say would, okay, well, 10 minutes on this and 10 minutes on that. But you certainly want to be alert to the fact that this is a proverb and this isn't a law. Where do I want to go with this? I'm not going to say that. I suppose we get into trouble. For example, Proverbs stay with that example of, to share a personal example, a friend of mine got very, very, very upset and really exercised over that proverb, teach your children the ways of the Lord. And of course they will grow up and follow him always. And sadly, his 3 children are still unbelievers. And he's kind of really beaten up by the fact that clearly I didn't get this right. Clearly I've done something wrong. This is my fault that my children are not yet disciples of Jesus. So to preach that proverb, for example, you want to be aware and teaching your people, well, I think this is a generally true truth. This does not mean that every Christian parent will always have all their children wonderful, shining examples of disciples of Jesus. It's a general promise, but it's not a specific promise for each individual. It's not a law in the sense of, and so you want to be alert to the form of Proverbs, the genre of Proverbs. Otherwise, of course, in preaching that particular proverb, you can really give people problems. That was a question, by the way, about the mistake of just taking a story from its original context and just applying it directly without an awful lot of thought into a contemporary context. And the example being the book of Esther. And if you know that well, you'll know why that could be a problem. I think this is where we need to be good Bible people. I think in a sense, the representing the story and the drama of Esther, for example, is a challenge. And the initial stage we want is for people just to inhabit that world. What must it have been like to have been Esther or Mordecai or another Israelite around that time, fearing for their lives with Haman and his schemes? That's the first challenge, I think, is for us to enter into that. And then in terms of application, that's where we have to really be very, very careful and not assume that it does just translate across through time. I mean, I think that's more of a question in terms of application and the technique of applying a text across time and culture. But you're right. I mean, that would take a long time to unpack that now. But you're right that the danger can be we just think, okay, straight across. If it's okay, we'll carry on. I don't want our time to be cut too short with this little case study I've got here in Luke chapter 7. We're going to read this. And as I read it, just try and spot some of these basic elements of the story that we've talked about. The setting, the role of the narrator. Give you a little clue, this is important in this one. Characters, who are the characters, and the plot. How does the plot unfold? So settle down and I'm going to read you a story. After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man sent under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. Okay, so let's work through some of these elements here. What's the setting? What did you notice? Capernaum, yeah. So Jesus enters Capernaum. When does he enter Capernaum? Okay, and what talk is that? Anyone know? Yeah, good. The Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. And he's come down and he's gone into Capernaum. Okay. You may want to chase, if you had your Bible dictionaries and your other resources, what's the significance of Capernaum? But anyway, we'll leave that for now because we're just going to deal with what's in front of us. We're going to leave the narrator for a minute. What characters do we have? Who are the different players in the scene in front of us? Jesus, absolutely. He's the hero of the whole story of Luke and, of course, the whole story of the Bible. So we've certainly got Jesus, good. A centurion, yeah. The servant, who we don't actually see, but is very much part of the story, yeah. The elders of the Jews, good. Is there anyone else? That's good. The friends, the servants of the centurion. Yeah, good. Okay. The people, yes, there are certainly crowds around as well that Jesus speaks to. Good. Okay. And what about the plot? Where does the tension enter? Where is if the setting is maybe verse 1, Jesus entering Capernaum, we know where we are, we can place it after the Sermon on the Mount. Where does the tension? Verse 4? Yes. Yeah. Good. Good. Yes. Now, I think this is very much a big part of the rising tension here. Actually, I wonder if the tension's introduced a little bit earlier. Verse 2? Uh-huh. And what exactly? Sorry? Okay. That's not exactly. Yeah. This is someone who is very, very sick. Good. And who is he? He's a servant of a centurion. What do we know about centurions in the time of Jesus in Israel? Romans. Yeah. Gentiles. They're the occupying forces, aren't they? They've effectively invaded the land, and they are not particularly welcome normally. And here is this commander in the occupying forces, a Gentile, coming to ask Jesus for help. And of course we have this issue of sickness and illness, and of course we know that as a big Bible theme. Sickness is not what we were created for. And we could chase that perhaps. So there's a lot of tension in here, isn't there? A centurion, servant, nearly dead, highly valued. So then that's the introduction of the tension. Now how does the tension rise? Anything strike you as strange? Verse 3? Yeah, sends the elders of the Jews. This Roman goes to the elders and says, hey, will you go and speak to Jesus on my behalf, please? Okay, that's strange. That's curious. Okay, couldn't he have just sent, some important Roman official, perhaps? Maybe even ordered Jesus to come to him. I don't know. Yeah, I think that we're going to see that a bit later on in his words. I think it's interesting, isn't it? But I think that's a good question, because do we think, if we were reading this for the first time, are we thinking, who does he think he is? Doesn't even come himself. He just sends some Jewish. Are we thinking that perhaps? If we know how the story finishes, we know that's not the case. But imagine reading the story for the first time. Why does he send these people? Does he think he's too important? Clearly he doesn't later on. But remember, we don't know the end of the story yet. So he sends elders of the Jews. That's curious, isn't it? How would you expect the elders of the Jews to ask Jesus this favor for this Roman centurion? Well, Jesus says, there's this Roman centurion, well, you know what we think about the Romans, but, he's asked us to come and heal his servants, so I don't know, maybe if you feel like it, you might want to swing by his house and help him. I don't know. Isn't that kind of how you'd expect the Jewish leaders to be treating this commander of the occupying forces? Maybe, yeah. Maybe they're like, well, why should we do you any favors? We might have expected that. And we get plenty of biblical evidence for people thinking like this about the Romans. But that's not what they do, is it? Verse 4, they pleaded with him earnestly. Wow. Jewish leaders are begging Jesus, come and do this. Please, come and help us. He is worthy to have you do this for him. That's curious, isn't it? They're clearly not good Calvinists. You know, they haven't got their total depravity of man sorted out, have they? You know, this man doesn't, none of us deserve anything from you, God. What does Jesus say? Well, actually, he doesn't deserve anything from me. No, there's no comment. The narrator doesn't comment on that. He just says, Jesus went with them. Yeah. What was Jesus thinking at that point? You know, this man deserves you to help him, Jesus. Really? No comment. Just reflect on that, perhaps. You know, it's kind of... So do you see there's just one kind of curiosity stacked on top of another? The problem is one thing, but the rising tension is more to do with, this is strange, this is unusual. Do you see? I think our curiosity levels, if we're really engaging in the story, should be rising here. We should be thinking, wow, this is unusual. Romans behaving like this and Jews behaving like this towards Romans, this isn't normal. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. Yes. Yes. Yes, I think this is beginning to say a lot about, and we'll see later on, how much does he know about Jesus and who Jesus is? I think the answer is an awful lot. Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. Why ask a carpenter to come and fix your servant? Yeah, good point. Okay, so let's keep going. We're running a little short on time. So Jesus goes, verse 6. Then what do we have? When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Oh, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof." We've seen that word worthy before, haven't we? He is worthy to have you do this for them. He deserves this, Jesus. And yet his view of himself is much more humble, isn't it? I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. Now, if we're engaging with this story, aren't we thinking, wow, here is a Roman soldier, an important guy. You know, he's not a nobody. He has people around him every day telling him he's something. Even the Jewish leaders are saying he's something. Jesus, he deserves your help. And yet he's saying, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. I'm not worthy to see your face. Isn't that curious? Isn't that just rising the tension again? This is just one more curiosity, isn't it? We should be marveling at this. I suspect we're so familiar with the story that we're not. And this is why we need to re-enter the world and live it. And not just saying, oh yeah, but we know how it's going to finish. So, okay. Therefore verse 7, I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, let my servant be healed. I too am a man under authority, and so on. In other words, Jesus, just as I command soldiers to go and they go, and to come and they come, you command creation. You can just speak and my servant will be healed. You could command sickness to go away. We've already seen in Luke, Jesus commands demons to come out of people and so on. Jesus, you are, just as I am Lord over 100 soldiers, you are Lord over creation. It's a staggering statement, isn't it? And in the context of Luke itself, we've been asking for some time now, who is this person? What is his identity? Who is Jesus? And here's this person who seems to get it more clearly than nearly everyone. And he is a Roman centurion, a Gentile commander of the occupying forces. It's staggering, isn't it? The tension is rising. So where does the tension resolved? And Jesus is marveled. In some translations, Jesus is amazed. Turning to the crowd that followed him, the conclusion Jesus gives us is, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And it's almost as though verse 10, that's kind of almost incidental. Oh yeah, and by the way, they went home and the servant was fine. Yeah, the rising drama here is more about the curiosity and the unbelievably clear way this Roman centurion seems to be thinking. That's almost more of the drama than, is this servant going to be healed or is he not? I mean, there is that. I think we do want to know if this servant's going to be okay. I'm not saying that's not important. But it's almost as though the rising drama here is these staggering things that people are saying about somebody else in the story. That's the emotional curve. What these people think of the centurion and what the centurion actually thinks about himself. And perhaps the most important conclusion, of course, is what is Jesus' assessment of the centurion? And of course, that is the assessment that for all of us is the most important thing. Where I'm starting to preach.